Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm Mike Brown, Dean of GW's Elliott School of International Affairs, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the Elliott School and the campus of the George Washington University. It's a particular pleasure to welcome our distinguished speaker, Anne-Marie Slaughter, to the Elliott School. Welcome. This evening's program is co-sponsored by two of our programs, the Distinguished Women in International Affairs Speaker Series and the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication. And the Institute is itself co-sponsored by the Elliott School and the School of Media and Public Affairs here at GW. The Distinguished Women in International Affairs Speaker Series is now one of our signature programs. It's in its 5th year, and it brings renowned women leaders to the GW campus to engage with students, faculty, alumni, and members of our extended academic community on critical global issues. I won't mention all of the distinguished speakers in this series, but I will mention just a couple of the people who have been with us in the last year or so. Mira Shankar, the ambassador of India, Renee Jones-Boss, the ambassador of the Netherlands, Dana Priest, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist from the Washington Post, from the State Department. The first speaker in the series was Paula Dobriansky, who was then Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs. More recently, Ellen Tauscher, Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, Milan Vivir, the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues. And the most recent speaker in this series, just a couple of weeks ago, was Zainab Zalbi, the founder and CEO of Women for Women International. And our distinguished speaker this evening, Anne-Marie Slaughter, certainly belongs in that extraordinary pantheon of great leaders. One of the traditions in this series is for our distinguished speaker to be introduced by one of our distinguished students. And in that tradition, it's my pleasure to introduce Jessica Krosowski. Jessica is a second-year graduate student here at the Elliott School in the International Affairs program, where she's specializing in Latin America and international security issues. She's also a program assistant in the master's program for international affairs. In her spare time, she works at the State Department and the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, where she works on the Fulbright program, in fact, working directly for the Fulbright board on an array of projects. She did her undergraduate studies at John Carroll University. She has done volunteer work in Chile, Nicaragua, Ecuador, and the Dominican Republic. And after graduating from the Elliott School next year, Jessica would like to work in the public sector, where she hopes to help shape U.S. policy toward Latin America. Ladies and gentlemen, Jessica Krosowski.
Thank you, Dean Brown, for the kind introduction. I'm honored to be here this evening to introduce Dr. Anne-Marie Slaughter, who has been a strong voice in the field of international relations and who has also made significant contributions to the advancement of women through her own leadership experiences in academia and now in government. Dr. Slaughter currently serves in the prestigious role of Director of Policy Planning at the U.S. State Department, a position to which she was appointed by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in January of 2009. Prior to her time at the State Department, Dr. Slaughter served as the Bert G. Kerstetter 66th University Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University and was Dean of Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Dr. Slaughter also spent some time teaching at Harvard's Kennedy School and at the University of Chicago Law School. As you can tell, Dr. Slaughter's professional accomplishments are too numerous to give justice to in one evening. Perhaps most relevant to our discussion tonight, however, is her notable work on global governance and ways to best meet the range of challenges facing the United States and the international community today. Dr. Slaughter has long discussed how today's world stage is full of serious challenges for American leadership. For the other graduate students in the room, these include many of the issues we grapple with every day in class, from the challenges of conflict resolution, obstacles facing sustainable international development models, to concerns about international security. Coming up with solutions to our most serious global challenges will require more citizens to step forward and take on greater leadership roles, both domestically and abroad. It is through this strengthening of civilian power that we can build partnerships with others and in turn tackle many of these pressing global issues more collaboratively. Many of us in the room tonight are beginning our careers in public and private sectors, academia, in think tanks, and elsewhere. We recognize that we will soon be the next generation working toward solutions to our most pressing global problems. Therefore, I believe I speak for many when I say how grateful we are to have someone here this evening that is so expertly qualified on tonight's topic, leading through civilian power. Dr. Slaughter, we look forward to your wise insights and sincerely appreciate you giving us your time this evening. Once again, it is a true honor to introduce to you this evening Dr. Anne Marie Slaughter.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. For many reasons, to see my old friend Dean Brown, to visit a neighboring public policy school, and it is truly neighboring from my current position. And particularly, I have to confess, because it was a Distinguished Women Leaders series, I'm very struck that I know every single woman you mentioned quite well, who has spoken here before, not that you listed everyone, which says to me that the circles of women in foreign policy are still quite small. But part of the purpose of lectures series like this, and particularly at schools like this with rising young women who want to study foreign policy, is precisely to expand those circles. So I'll just start with that. I think it's particularly appropriate because I am the Director of Policy Planning. I am the first woman Director of Policy Planning, a line that starts with George Kennan, and I have to say kind of goes downhill from there because nobody can quite live up to that standard. However, in the State Department, all the assistant secretaries, the undersecretaries, the deputy secretaries, and indeed the secretaries have on their wall, as you walk in, all your predecessors. And it's a very daunting row of pictures. And in my case, it is still all male, and I will be the first woman. I sometimes think that part of Secretary Clinton's agenda is to add a woman to every wall, at least one. So I'm going to talk to you about leading through civilian power, and I think I will certainly be leaving time for questions. The thing that I have spent the most time on as the Director of Policy Planning is the first ever quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review. Now, since Washington is the land of acronyms, that is the QDDR, it was patterned on the Quadrennial Defense Review, the QDR. There's now a Quadrennial Homeland Security Review, the QHSR, and I could go on. The only one that's at all catchy is the Quadrennial Intelligence Community Review, which at least has the acronym of the QUICR. Ours is not the quicker, but we hope it will be, it'll justify the length of time it has taken to produce it by what it contains. I'm not going to give you a lecture on the QDDR, but I am going to elaborate on the overarching theme of the QDDR, which is leading through civilian power. And Secretary Clinton has just published a Foreign Affairs article by that same title that's out in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs. But I want to break down the subject in a different way tonight. I want to talk about it in a sort of traditional way that you might lecture about a kind of framework for who, what, when, why, and how we need to lead through civilian power. And let me start with just, what are we talking about when we talk about civilian power? Who is the face of civilian power? We know who the face of military power is. We see them in the newspaper every day. But who's the face of civilian power, the official face of civilian power? It's our diplomats, obviously. It's also our development professionals. They are the twin faces of civilian power. That's a very important place to start out, because part of Secretary Clinton's legacy as Secretary of State will be that she has elevated development to be an equal pillar of our foreign policy alongside diplomacy and defense. And I'm going to come back to why she's done that, but I need to start with the proposition that for my generation, when you thought about being in foreign policy and you thought about what foreign policy was and the civilian face of foreign policy, you thought about diplomats. Development was very important, but somewhat apart It wasn't the core part of foreign policy. Going forward, anybody who studies foreign policy will have to, if you're a security expert, if you are a political economist, you're going to have to know at least as much about development as in my generation you had to know about arms control. During the Cold War, Dean Brown will remember this, you didn't have to be an arms control expert, but if you couldn't talk about throw weights and MIRVs and SLBMs and ICBMs, you really weren't a serious player. Going forward, anybody who is doing more traditional foreign policy is going to have to know about the debates in development, the cutting edge issues in development, and at least be able to link up what they do to development solutions, because the problems we face will require development as well as diplomatic solutions. So let me start with diplomats and development experts. Civilian power is broader still, though, because if you go to any of our embassies, or indeed you look at the logbook of any of our embassies, obviously the Foreign Service is there, and USAID has missions in 84 countries or operates in 84 countries. But if you were to look, you would see a steady increase in the number of officials from other government agencies. You would see people from agriculture. You would see people from justice. You would see people for the Centers for Disease Control. You would see people from the Environmental Agency. Indeed, one student of mine who once spent a summer in an embassy in Africa said that he felt like he was a hotel for different federal government officials coming through. Now, again, diplomats and development professionals frame our foreign policy, but one of the important trends over the last 20, 30, 40 years has been the increasing engagement of what were once formerly domestic agencies in foreign affairs. And I didn't even include the financial agencies, the Treasury, the Securities and Exchange Commission, even the Fed, all have their own overseas programs. So start with that, the face of civilian power, diplomats, development professionals, and government officials from a whole range of different agencies. Second thing just to think about here is if you look at that whole picture, you see traditional diplomacy and traditional development we're still negotiating treaties or trying to, and brokering deals and gathering information, all the things that diplomats do, and we're working with governments on their development plans in many different ways. But we're also seeing a growing number of operations on the ground. And this is connected to all these other agencies. You know, when the National Park Service or the U.S. Geological Survey or the CDC or the Department of Energy or any of those agencies go into a country, they're running a program. They're running a program on the ground. We do that increasingly in the State Department. The Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement runs many programs on the ground. So does democracy, rights, and labor. And of course, that is a core part of what development does. Take it all together, and what you have a picture of is global civilian operations. Now again, if I asked my kids, I have two sons, 14 and 12, if I said, who does operations? Which part of the U.S. government does operations? They'd say the military. They might say the CIA, but they would think of ops as essentially a military thing. Not so. I mean, obviously, yes, so. We have military ops, but we have a growing amount of really what you should think of as global civilian operations on the ground, not just in our embassies, but on the ground in countries around the world. So that's the who. You've got a whole cast of civilians, diplomats, development professionals, other federal government agencies doing global civilian operations around the world. So let me come to the what. So if that's the face of civilian power, what is it? I mean, how do we exercise civilian power? So again, diplomacy, clearly, although diplomacy has evolved in many different ways. I recently came across a quote from Thomas Jefferson. He had 16 envoys to countries, some ambassadors, some consuls, and he asked them to gather such political and economic intelligence as would be useful to the conduct of foreign affairs. Well, they do that. Obviously, our diplomats are superb reporters. They observe, they analyze, they send cables. But even in Jefferson's time, and certainly today, they go way beyond the work of observing and reporting and representing U.S. positions. They negotiate, obviously, in many different contexts, but increasingly also, as I said, they run programs, they engage with publics, and we're talking about public diplomacy, and engaging with publics is not what it used to be. It's not doing what I'm doing now, giving a lecture and expecting a foreign audience to respond. It's running events, creating public-private partnerships, creating networks of foreign contacts, much more on the ground. Development, and development's changing in lots of different ways, becoming increasingly empirical, people running programs, measuring their results. But I want to think about civilian power even more broadly. A lot of what we do, again, we negotiate and we persuade and we represent and we report, but we also convene and connect. One of the things the U.S. government does, and one of the things civilians do, is to bring together either people from our government with foreign citizens, so a lot of these programs. A good example would be the Lower Mekong Initiative, which is a program that Secretary Clinton launched with the countries of the Mekong Delta. It's about river management, right? So you would think, what is the Secretary of State doing launching a program about how you manage a river? And part of that program, there's actually a sister river program between the Mekong and the Mississippi. And the Army Corps of Engineers is there, and the National Park Service is there. What we're doing is connecting our expertise, we have a lot of expertise in river management, with the folks on the ground in different countries who need that expertise. At the same time, we're bringing those countries together. We are strengthening regional ties. We think that's actually very important. This is a region obviously important to us, a region that also worries about, it both depends on China and worries about China in various ways. But what we do when we create these programs is convening and connecting. And we do that on the ground constantly. And in many ways, that's what public diplomacy has become. We also, we assist, we mentor, we train, and we empower. If you look at how development experts think they're working today, and again, many of our programs, what we're really trying to do is to help build sustainable capacity abroad. We're trying to bring new technologies to people around the world. We have a new program called M-Women, which is about increasing the number of cell phones that women have worldwide, because there is a gender gap in cell phones as there are in so many other things. But with a cell phone, a woman can basically get what to expect when you're expecting via text. You all are a little what to expect when you're expecting, but when you're pregnant, it tells you on a regular basis, here's what you should be seeing. And if you're not seeing this, go to a clinic. Here's what you should be eating. Empowering women to take charge of their own health, empowering women to take charge of their own banking, empowering women to actually text to a common number when they see violence or want to report crimes. Countless ways that we empower. So increasingly, we're not just negotiating with states and representing our positions and doing the work we've always done. We are working on the ground and empowering others. Way to think about it more broadly, when you think about what is civilian power, it is, again, it's the power of negotiation and persuasion. It can be the power of coercion. I don't want to make this sound like this is all kind of kumbaya. Civilian power includes sanctions. It includes economic coercion. It includes various kinds of organizing political pressure on a particular nation. That's power over. That's power. You have power over someone else. You can compel them to do what they need to do. But increasingly, civilian power is also about power with. It's the power of bringing lots of folks together and enabling them to do things that they can't do on their own, or giving them the technology that allows them to connect to others. So that's a way of thinking about what is civilian power that is beyond just not military power or diplomatic power or the power of development programs. It's a whole set of skills and a mindset. And the last thing I'll say there is that civilian power increasingly focuses on individuals as much as on states. This is also something Secretary Clinton does instinctively. I think probably also as an elected politician. Wherever she goes, she of course meets with all her counterparts in governments, but she always engages people directly, and not just for a sort of public relations op. She wants to actually engage in a conversation, but she also wants to essentially treat the people of a particular country as I don't want to say an object of our diplomacy because it sounds very passive, but engage them diplomatically just as she engages the government. And a civilian lens allows you to do that. It allows you to think of about governments and how you engage governments, and also to think about the people within a particular country and how you engage them and how you connect them to our people. So that is the who and the what. The when has a very short answer. When do we lead through civilian power? Right now. It's a good moment. Secretary Gates has been calling for the demilitarization of American foreign policy. When the Secretary of Defense starts making that argument, it's a good time. And it isn't just Secretary Gates. Ambassador Holbrooke was telling me last week that he had gotten an email from a general who was, in a particular region in the world who said, look, the face of American power here is the military. It's a general. That's not the image we want in the world. That is not useful for us. Even to take a very strategic calculation, that is not useful. I'm sure you've all studied the security dilemma. You do not want nations thinking of us as constantly projecting military force. It encourages people to respond in kind. But more broadly, that's not who we are as a nation. We have a fantastic military. I was part of the group that wrote the National Security Strategy, committed to maintaining our military advantage. I have the highest respect for the men and women in our military. But that is not our national tradition. If anything, our military is hugely proud of the tradition of civilian rule over the military. When they have military education and training with other militaries, that's a deep part of what they communicate. And you think about somebody like George Washington, Dwight Eisenhower, our great generals have often been the ones to most prize peace and the power on the civilian side and not using force, having it but not using it. So now is a very good time to be leading through civilian power. Why? Other than the fact that I represent the State Department and USAID, and these, obviously I'm on the civilian side, but there's really a number of deeper reasons. So here, I'll go to where I might normally have started if I were doing this lecture in a more straightforward way. Let's think about the problems we face in the world. When I often talk about this, I describe my bedside reading, and people think, God, your life is grim. I also read many novels and escape, although generally to cop shows, actually. So, but at least they can be resolved in an hour, unlike all these problems. So if you think, here's my top 7 list. I would start with proliferation of nuclear weapons, biological weapons. I would then go to terrorism and the spread of violent extremism, and of course you put those two things together and you have the ultimate nightmare. I would talk about the arc of conflict from Israel through Iraq, through Iran, through Afghanistan and Pakistan, either actual or potential conflict. I'd talk about the stability of the global economy or the state of the global economy. I'd talk about pandemics, climate change, and energy scarcity, energy security, resource scarcity. Any one of those has the potential to kill thousands, tens of thousands, possibly millions of Americans. So they all rank up there in the list of foreign policy problems that you have to worry about. One of the problems we have in the State Department is you can no longer prioritize those. You can no longer say, you know what, I think we're going to focus on climate change. The H1N1, not so important. The day that the H1N1 is fatal and can be communicated by aerosol, you'll be worrying. And in 1 week, after the 4th month I was there, in the 1 week in May, we had the Taliban within 100 miles of Islamabad. We had the global economy looking like it was headed for a double-dip recession, and we had the H1N1. all in 1 week. So you can't prioritize all those problems. So you think about those problems, and very few are susceptible of military solutions. Deterrence, yes. Deterrence is important, and obviously in the arc of conflict I described, we have troops on the ground still in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So this is not an argument that military force is not important, but most of those issues, countering the spread of violent extremism, the global economy, climate change, global epidemics, even certainly proliferation. We do not want to be addressing that through military means if we can possibly help it. Energy security. Those are all problems that have to be addressed through civilian power. And we ought to recognize that. We have recognized that. If you look at the national security strategy, it's very clear that that's what we have to build. We have to build our diplomatic and development capabilities, our law enforcement, our intelligence capabilities across the board. So I think that's the starting reason for why we have to lead through civilian power. Second, I would say, as fine as our military is, I think this is what we do best. I think this is what we do best not only because of our diplomats and our development professionals, but because it allows us to harness many more resources across American society. Many of you may go to work for NGOs. Some of you may go to work for corporations in government affairs or in the environmental parts of corporations or in social responsibility or in the core part of corporations. You will be part, or your entities will be part of global solutions to problems. Indeed, none of the problems I just listed can be solved by governments alone. Let's take global health just as one example. The major progress that has been made in tackling HIV/AIDS, certainly PEPFAR has played a very important role, no question. Governments generally, the UN, absolutely. But you never get there without the Gates Foundation, without the Merck, the pharmaceuticals. Merck ran a very important programs recognizing as a partner with the government of Botswana, with our own government, and with Gates. If you think about what happens in New York every September, you have two big events. You have UNGA, classic diplomacy. In fact, I just said that one undersecretary described the UN General Assembly as speed dating for diplomats. And there is an element of that. So it's classic diplomacy, but a lot of very important work gets done there. But the other big event that happens at the end of September in New York is the Clinton Global Initiative. And at the Clinton Global Initiative, panel after panel, very distinguished people get up and commit to solving global problems and really make a commitment. And each panel looks the same. There are generally a couple of government officials, often folks who've come from UNGA to go over to the Clinton Global Initiative. In fact, we managed to snarl all of New York traffic this year just so that Mrs. Clinton could go and join Mr. Clinton, or Secretary Clinton and President Clinton coming from UNGA over to CGI. So they're government officials, but then there are always a CEO, head of an NGO, I always say a thinker or two. There's somebody from a university or a think tank, often a foundation head. That's the coalition that is going to solve global problems. And that is something that we as a nation, we're not the only nation, but we do that better than just about anyone, in part because we don't trust government as much as many other nations. And whatever you think about that, it does lead to much more reliance on civil society and on economic actors. And finally, we have to rely on civilian power because of cost. In the QDDR, we are intensely aware of the budget environment we are in, and the most recent elections did not bring to power a group of people who love the State Department and USAID. So we have to focus on how do we spend taxpayer dollars most effectively. And this is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. What it takes to put 1,000 diplomats on the ground, which can do a lot, diplomats, technical experts, development professionals, versus what it takes to put 1,000 soldiers on the ground. And each combat soldier has close to 9 in the tooth-to-tail ratio. It's no comparison, right? The State Department has a budget of $56 billion, and the Defense Department has a budget of $800 billion. Now, I'm not suggesting we're going to even that out. I mean, not in the sense of even, but in terms of where's the cost-effective investment, where do we want to be putting our dollars? It's in civilian power now, so we don't have to use military power later. And finally, how are we going to do this? Well, you know, the QDDR is going to come out, and everybody's going to accept all the recommendations, and it's going to be perfect. And I'm going to go back to teaching. So, you know, we got it covered. How are we going to do it? We are going to adopt a lot of reforms. This is a document of 100 pages, and it is full of some highly technical reforms and then some broader ones. But I work for a secretary who finishes what she started. I have watched her order up matrices on things like the transition from the military to civilian control in Iraq, and she breaks it down into everything that has to be done, and then she holds people accountable for doing it. This is also the first quadrennial review. This is not just a report that sits on a shelf. This is part of what is now an every 4-year major planning process, and we have an annual planning process in between. So there will be a lot of reforms made. They'll be slow and painful. I'm not that naive, but they will happen. It will also happen through building a new relationship between state and USAID. And I don't know to what extent you're probably all readers of the cable. There's lots of rumors and news supposedly about infighting between state and USAID and other agencies. And of course there is turf fighting. But fundamentally, we are really rethinking how state and aid interact as equal pillars of American foreign policy under the Secretary of State. And as we do that, and as our diplomacy and development initiatives mesh more and more, and also the other agencies, we are going to be able to project civilian power much more effectively. And finally, we're going to do that through reaching out to the private sector, to the civic sector. As I said, if you look at the way the Clinton Global Initiative operates, you see a whole coalition of civic sector and private sector and government actors. That's an approach the Secretary is working very hard to bring inside the State Department as well. So I think it is the time to do this. We've got the people, we have the rationale, we have the process, and frankly, as an American, I am very proud to be a part of returning to a very great tradition of leading in the world through civilian power. Thank you. Happy to take questions. Yeah.
I just recently signed up for foreign service in the Elliott School.
Great.
Is there anything specifically that you see the test might get into, or issues that would be good, other than the Constitution, obviously, as I start to study for it? Thanks.
So the question was, do I have any idea of what's on the Foreign Service test? I can't help you very much, never having taken it myself. What I can tell you is that the QDDR has focused on parts of the test to try to encourage testing for innovation and entrepreneurship, but I'm not sure those reforms are going to be made by the time you make it. So I would talk to someone who's taken it recently. But I'm delighted that you're going to join. It's wonderful. Yeah, in the back.
Hi, my name's Lisa Backstrom. I'm a part of the Global Communications Program. You gave a lot of examples of great civilian-led efforts across the globe and some of the work that the State Department is going through currently to increase those efforts. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how the coordination between agencies, between federal, state, local governments could be improved in order to help all of those different efforts around the globe.
So state and local is yet a whole nother dimension, very important, increasingly important. And one of the things Secretary Clinton has done is to create a special representative for intergovernmental affairs. So when I first heard this, I thought, intergovernmental affairs, that's what we do, that's diplomacy. She meant between the federal government and state and local governments. And Rita Jo Lewis is the special representative, and she is exactly engaging mayors and governors and various state authorities. So that's a wonderful thing to be doing, but I think we got to start right here in Washington with the federal government. I think this is going to be a slow process, but one that is starting to happen. It frankly there needs to be a bargain struck there in both directions. So we at the State Department and at USAID have to be much more willing not only to accept, but to embrace the capabilities of other government agencies. And the natural tendency is you build your own capability. You want to do global health? We'll do global health. So what if the CDC does global health? You know, we're the State Department, we're not the CDC. That's not going to go away completely, but what we're saying in the QDDR, and obviously for cost reasons, is we're never going to be the CDC. I don't care what we build. We will not be the Centers for Disease Control. So what we need to do is we do need to hire some expertise, but we have to build in as a condition of doing business that we're going to reach out to the expertise across the government. The flip side is they have to recognize you can't just go run a program in a country. I mean, even if you're nominally, you check in with the embassy, there's a framework there. There's a strategy. There are people who understand that culture and the politics and the economics very deeply. There's significance in terms of government relations. So we're essentially saying we'll lead. Obviously, the National Security Council will lead where they're engaged, but they're not engaged in 180 countries all the time. You have to work within our framework. We have to embrace what you bring. I think that is a bargain that can be struck. I think it's starting in various ways. It's happening on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan more than it's happened in other places. But I think it's going to take a while for people to start having that mentality. The other thing that will have to happen, and we are recommending some things along these lines, is building in knowledge of the interagency as a requirement for promotion in the Foreign Service. So you reward people. It's like Goldwater Nichols, but we can't do that wholly. You reward people for actually spending time in another agency or working well with them in the field. There on the side.
Good evening. I'm a graduate student in the Political Science Department here at GW, and I'm interested in the role of democracy promotion in U.S. foreign policy. And so I was wondering if you could talk about some of the differences in goals and strategy between democracy promotion and development in U.S. foreign policy, and also how does democracy promotion fit into the overarching theme of civilian power and diplomacy?
That's a great question. So I always, I give many talks on the national security strategy, and when I do, I start from the perspective of our national interests, because that's where a national security strategy has to start. And I say, the first two, if I woke you up in the middle of the night and said, what are the first two national interests, I think you'd get it right. I think you'd say security and prosperity, no surprises there. But the third fundamental national interest in the national security strategy is respect for universal values. I emphasize that in part because you read all these newspaper analyses about how President Obama is a realist. A realist does not put respect for universal values as the third fundamental interest. But I also start there because look at that language. It doesn't say promote democracy. It says our national interest is respect for universal values. Now that is saying we will be far better off in a world in which universal values are respected in every country, which means democracy and human rights. But the language is carefully chosen. Not promote, because it has too much of the sense of imposition. It does mean support, strongly support, stand for, support materially, support morally. So I start with that globally, as the way it's written in the national security strategy. For the State Department, and you hinted at this, Secretary Clinton strongly believes in promoting civil society, and she's appointed a special envoy for civil society, and her speech at Krakow I strongly recommend as talking about really the threat that civil society faces in many countries, and thus a threat to democracy. But she also strongly believes that democracy and development go together, and that when we think about democracy, we often think about civil and political rights, obviously, the right to assemble, the right of free expression, but the capacity to exercise those rights, the food, the education, the health, the ability to be a citizen in a polity is every bit as important. And that's often the development agenda. Other countries would call that economic, social, and cultural rights. We don't frame it that way, but she has been very clear, empowering women, women and children, focusing on health, education, livelihoods. The development agenda is a key part of our democracy and human rights agenda. And that is, as when Administrator Shah talks about the 5 focus areas that he is really emphasizing in development, democracy and governance is one, but it's through a development lens. Not entirely, but largely. Yeah, they're in the back.
Hi. You've talked a lot about promoting civil society in conflict areas, and I was wondering if you, since part of what we're talking about is women and public policy, if you would talk a little bit about, is there a tension between funding programs which deal with ex-combatants and programs that deal with promoting women as a way to promote peace, or is there a way to integrate both kinds of programs together, or just what are your...
Thank you for asking. So I know less about the demilitarization programs. They are hugely important, or disarmament and reintegration programs. Although it's a good example of some of the connecting and convening we do. My office helped connect folks in the DRC who were working with demobilized insurgents with folks from Colombia who had done that with the FARC. We know programs that have worked in Colombia. You might not think of those 2 countries, but we've managed to connect them. But the focus on women as part of a peace and security agenda is very important. Secretary Clinton just gave a wonderful speech at the UN 2 weeks ago on the UN resolution that talks about the importance of engaging women in peace negotiations and peace building and peace and security issues. We have not made a huge amount of progress in that regard. We work at it, even in Afghanistan, we work at it. But the evidence is there in the impact of engaging women, not just empowering women generally, but engaging women in the peace process is very strong. I'm not sure we always think about it in this country as much as we might want to, and we obviously have we have a long way to go culturally in many countries, but it is something the Secretary is very committed to, and it also helps break down the stereotype of gender issues being all on the development side or women's issues being all on the development side and guns and bombs being really for men. Yeah, my colleague.
Thank you very much for this talk. I have done some work with our Office of Reconstruction and Stabilization. I was the deputy there a couple of years ago. And one of the disparities that we really found between civilian power and military power is that the military take planning very seriously. Yes. Very early on, they begin training their officers, and then they have mid-level and then upper level. When I was at SCRS, we were working with the military on trying to train a small cadre of people. I think the QDDR is really wonderful for the State Department and for USAID in terms of really undertaking a planning process. But my question, Madam Secretary, is, you've been promoted, how do you see training for State Department officers and USAID in the future in planning? Because it's very hard to talk with our military colleagues and work with them unless we have some of the planning skills that they have.
Absolutely. And I know my response to everything is there's a whole section in the QDDR about that, but there is. This is a question of resources, as you know. Many military officers spend up to 1/3 of their careers in training and education. It's phenomenal. I mean, in leadership education, in planning, in new technologies and new knowledge. General Petraeus is best advertisement for an MPA or a PhD in public policy there is. He says, sharpen your mind and you get challenged. We don't have those resources. We are increasing the size of the training float. The training float is what allows people to go into training because somebody has to take their position in the bureau or the embassy. We are increasing it substantially, but still from a very low base. So that's part of what has to happen, is we just have to make it possible for our people to get that kind of education. And then, we really have to build a culture of planning. And it's really contrary to the classic generalist, crises are happening every 3 seconds and I respond. And in some sense, it has to be that way. The military plans for wars. I mean, yes, wars can be visited on us, but in general, they've got a whole lot more lead time, right? They can think, here's this threat and this is how we're going to meet it. And when they're thinking about operations in the field, lives depend on those operations. They have more time, plenty of incentive, and a kind of a culture that really does strengthen that kind of mindset. So we're focusing on how to give training and what training to give, but I think the larger issue is a cultural one, and our recommendations are around the planning you have to do on the ground, the planning you have to do in our offices, the strategic planning, but also bureau planning, and key part, connecting it to budgeting. And I think people from the corporate sector look at me like I'm crazy when I say that. What are you talking about? That your planning is not connected to your budget? Your priorities are not connected to your money? As you well know, our systems are not always the best they can be, but now we have a new deputy secretary whose job it is to connect the priorities to the money. Yeah.
My question is somewhat budget related. In making the case for civilian power to be the new face of American power, thank you. You can count boats and planes and bombs and you know what results they're going to have. It's more difficult to count the impact that people have. So in making the case in Congress and in the American public to concentrate more on civilian power, how do you sell that when it's so difficult to quantify the results?
Well, it's something we definitely have to be able to do. I mean, the first thing I would say, I haven't done the math, but it'd be wonderful to do the math of what one aircraft carrier would buy you. I suspect, half the State Department. So partly you just point out, look, even if you can't calculate exactly the impact, the cost is so much lower. But I think what you also can do is to show what we can do when we're able to have enough people to get in there to prevent conflicts before they break out. And you can use specific examples. Macedonia is the one everybody always uses, but I would use Kenya, actually, after the elections, where we really were able to be in there with our diplomats, with the UN too, it wasn't just us. So you can use those examples. I think the other thing that I would use if I were trying the American people is I would compare the size of our State Department to the Chinese Foreign Ministry. I mean, China is a rising power with soft power. They are flooding the zone. So why? Well, because having that many people on the ground, and we're never going to have that many people on the ground, but having that many people on the ground means there are people who are there to have the conversations, to go to the meetings, to spot the commercial opportunities, to see when there's a crisis looming. And I would use the point that this was true of us when we had not only hard power but the greatest soft power anywhere in the world, and also the diplomatic power. It's not just hard and soft. And I would point out it's much cheaper. And that we need to get back to that place, and other countries understand that secret. So your standing up tells me probably it's time for a glass of wine. I'm happy to sit down.
Well, I'm going to bring the formal proceedings to an end, but we do have a reception and an opportunity for some informal interaction. Anne-Marie, you mentioned the Cold War, and it reminded me that the world has changed a lot over the last few decades. The world's changing rapidly. It's becoming more complex. A lot of the changes have been fundamental. And in times like this, it's really important to have great thinkers like you inside and outside of government. And I think the country and the world have been very fortunate to have someone with your exceptional vision in such an extraordinarily important position here in Washington these past 2 years. I know you're anxious to get out of Washington and back home, but we hope you'll come back to DC from time to time, and we hope you'll stop by here whenever you can. On behalf of my colleagues here at the Elliott School, the students and faculty of the school, we have this small, congressionally authorized symbol of our very great admiration and appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.